All right, good morning, everybody. So just a quick announcement. If you're looking for the lecture recordings, first lecture, the audio didn't record, so I have to re-record the audio. The second lecture didn't record at all, so I have to re-record that video as well. I hope to have those up, if not this afternoon, then tomorrow. But I have to redo the videos because they just didn't record properly. Hopefully this one records properly and I don't have to redo it. Okay, so just to quickly review what we were doing at the end of last class. So we talked about integer overflow, right? So if you start out with an integer value, whenever you do arithmetic with two integer values, the result is always another integer value, right? So int plus int gives you back an int, right? Int minus int gives you back an int. And so that means if you start out with a value like integer min value, right, the most negative integer that you can represent, or the most negative int that you can represent, and if you subtract 1, you can't actually represent that value, right? So I can't represent the correct mathematical value. So what happens instead in Java is that the value wraps around to the other side, right? And so if you start at integer min value and subtract 1, you get integer max value, right? It wraps around to the largest positive int value, right? So with the integers, you get wraparound. With the floating point values, you don't get wraparound, right? So for double, there is a largest double value that you can represent. That's not infinity, right? Minus that value is the most negative value that you can represent. That's not negative infinity. Right? If you compute some value that exceeds the range of double, then it saturates, right? So two very large doubles multiplied together probably give you back positive infinity. A negative large value and another large value multiplied together will give you back negative infinity, right? So they don't wrap around, right? So the floating point numbers don't wrap around, they saturate, instead, right? And that's the behavior that's specified by a standard that's not a standard for Java. It's called the IEEE 754 standard, and that's the standard that's most commonly used in computing devices for floating point numbers. Okay. So in Python has, they have user-defined functions, right? I don't remember where I got to in this particular lecture. This is confusing for me because I have another course that uses similar lecture slides, and I get to a different place in both courses. So I'm not 100% sure where we left off. Sorry? To the import. Here. Awesome, thanks. Okay, so let's just quickly do this. So you know that Python has a function, right? Python functions, never mention what they return, right? It's simply def, name of the function, and the inputs, right? If the function returns something, there's no way you can tell that just by looking at the declaration of the function, right? So just by looking at that line there, there's no way I can tell that this function returns something, right? In Java, it's different, right? So in Java, there are no functions, right? Because everything so a function in Python is it's a piece of code that's got a name that you can reuse. It's not inside of anything else, right? So in Java, functions everything has to be inside of a class, right? So here I've got a similar what Java calls a method, right? Inside a class called lecture2, right? So the closest thing that Java has to a function is a static method, right? Public static method, right? So the method is similar. It's similar to a function, but it has to be defined inside of a class. So to call, so we got this function here. It reads public. I'll tell you what all these pieces mean in a minute, right? So public static int max2 int a int b, right? So a and b, those are your inputs for this particular method, right? A and b, whatever values you pass to the method, they have to be ints, right? Or they have to be automatically convertible to int, right? So for example, you're allowed to pass in a short and a short here because Java can convert a short to an int. Automatically. You can't pass in a double here. If you use a double in a double, that doesn't work. So the language does not let you convert from a double back to an int automatically. Right? So to call the method, I remember I said that this isn't exactly true, right? So that import statement's not exactly correct. It's close enough for now, right? So I have to import the class that contains the method that I want to use, right? And then inside some method in my second class, right? So this is in a second class called test lecture2, right? To call the method that's in lecture2, I use the name of the method and then dot and then max2, Right? You can do a similar thing in Python if you import a module without specifically importing a specific function. All right, so in Python, indentation is fundamental to the language, right? So you all know this now. Probably took you a little while to figure this out and get straight, right? But you know that in Python, indentation, it's a fundamental part of the language, right? So it defines what a Python calls blocks, right? If you have an if statement, you indent the body of the if statement, and so on and so forth. Right? Java, indentation is strictly for readability. Right? So in other words, the compiler doesn't care, doesn't really care what your code looks like. Right? So in other words, the indentation doesn't matter to the compiler. Right? So I can take my method back here, right, which is nicely indented. Right? So here's the class, right, starts on the left-hand side. Anything inside the class, you indent one level. Right? So main is indented one level. Anything inside of the main method gets indented one level, and so on and so forth. So here I can take my lecture 2 class and rewrite it, get rid of all the indentation, change all of the indentation so that it looks really hard to read, right? And so this is hard to read, right? So for a human, this is awkward to read. Compiler doesn't care, right? So just because the compiler doesn't care doesn't mean that you shouldn't care, right? So when you're writing code for the class, you should make sure that your code is indented consistently, right? So other readers of your code, those are the people who care about indentation, right? And in general, how your code is styled. Right? So in particular, your TAs are going to care what it looks like, right? If I end up marking an assignment, then I'm going to care what it looks like, right? So I don't actually specifically outline the set of style rules that you have to use in this course, right? So what you should do, though, is follow the examples that are in the lecture slides and that are in the notebooks, because everything in those two sources, those are all formatted consistently. Okay, so instead of indentation, Java uses braces to delimit the bodies of classes, the bodies of methods, if statements, loops, and other things. Right? In Java, the braces are required. Right? And so instead of using indentation, which you did in Python, you now have to switch over to braces. Right? So here's my class lecture 2, and then the body of the class is inside of a pair of matched braces. Right? So everything here, that's called the body of the class. Oh, next lecture. So this is the lecture slides numbered 3. Wrong course, sorry. From Python here. And I think this set of lecture slides actually includes a bunch, yeah, so it starts at the double stuff. Okay, so we'll just jump ahead. Did I change the order? No, here we go, okay. All right, now for the time being, all of our classes are going to be public, right? So if you mark a class as being public, that's what's called an access modifier, right, which Python doesn't have. Right? So an access modifier indicates what other classes can see the class lecture 2. Right? So if you have a public class, all other classes can see the class lecture 2. Right? So they can see the class. They know that the class exists. Right? And so that's what the public modifier on the class means. Right? Lecture 2 here is what's called a top-level class. So it's a class that's not defined inside of something else. Right? In Java, when you make a top-level class, it belongs in its own source code file. Right? So the file that contains lecture 2 would be called big L lecture2.java. Right? So the class name and the file name have to match in Java. Right? And inside that class, there would only be, well, there should only be the class lecture 2 as a top-level class. It turns out you're allowed to put more than one top-level class in the same Java file, but then things become complicated. Right? It turns out you can only actually use the first top-level class. All of the other top-level classes are not visible. Okay, so for the time being, all of our methods are going to be public and static. Right? So if you mark a method as being public, that means that the method is visible to all other classes, right? Assuming the class is also visible to all other classes. Right? So if the class is visible to everybody and the method is visible to everybody, then anybody can use the method that's marked public. There's two different class access modifiers. There's four different method modifiers. And so we'll look at all of these later on in the course, right? For now, everything's just public. Okay, now you also, for the time being, we also need the keyword static, right? So for the time being, all of our methods are static, right? Static on a method means that the method belongs to the class lecture2, right? What that also means is that if you want to call the method, you have to use the name lecture2 to get to the method, right? So static means the method is associated with the class, right? Later on, we're going to see methods that are associated with individual objects, right? And in those methods, you don't use the class name to call the method, right? You use an object reference, right? For now, all the methods that we write will be static, right? And that's why when I tried to call this method from another class, I had to write lecture2.max2. Oh, I think I missed something here. No, we did. We talked about this before in the previous lecture. Never mind. I was thought that I was going to say this is a weird implementation of max2, but I think I told you that in the last class, right? This is a strange implementation of max2, right? Normally, you would just use an if statement to write this method. There is a reason that it's written this way, and we'll get to that in another lecture. Okay. Oops. Sorry. All right. So if you have parameters to your method, you have to give them types, right? So the parameters of your method, so A and B here, these are just variables that belong to the method, right? So int A says that the method max2 has a variable called A, right? Int B says that max2 has a variable called B. To use max2, you have to supply two values A and B, right? Now, because these are variables, right, in Java, all variables have types, so I have to say what their types are, right? And so here we have int and int. Java method is allowed to return either 0 values or exactly 1 value. The exactly 1 is inconvenient, right? In Python, you may have written a method that returns a tuple, right? So multiple values all at once. It turns out sometimes that's really convenient, right? In Java, you can only return 1 value at a time at most, right? So if a method returns a value, it must say what is the type of the value that it returns, right? So here, here max2 says that it's going to return 1 int value, right? And that type must appear in front of the method name, right? So here max2 returns an int. If a method does not return a value, right, then you have to say that it returns nothing, which is in Java means is void, right? So our main method, which doesn't return anything in Java, right? Its return type is always void, right? So you can write a method, returns no value. You have to say that void is the return type. Okay, if your method returns a value, then there has to be what's called a return statement, right? So similar to Python, right? So if a Python method, function returns a value, there's a return statement in it, right? Just like in Python, the return statement stops the method, right? So here our method max2, right? It says it returns an int. So somewhere there has to be a return statement, right? So return blah, right? Where the blah has to be an int, right? Or it has to be automatically convertible to int, right? So for example, this could be a short, and then Java will convert that to an int, right? But you can't put in a double here, or a long for that matter, and hope that the compiler will automatically convert that to int. That doesn't work. So as soon as that return statement finishes running, the method stops running. Right? So return statements end the execution of a method. Void methods have no return statement because they return no value. Right? So all of our main methods, typically, there's no return statement. However, an empty return statement is legal. Right? So I can say return nothing. Right? The return statement still ends the method. Right? So execution of the method stops, but no value is returned. That's legal, and no one writes that. Right? So you probably should not write that in your methods. In your methods that return nothing. Occasionally it's useful. Right? Occasionally you're going to have some if statement. You want to do one of two different things. Right? So occasionally you want to stop the method in one of those branches. Right? So occasionally the empty return statement is useful. Okay, so you know that there's if statements in Python. Right? You know that you write if there's a condition. Right? There is a condition. If you want to combine conditions, you can use and or, right? The words and the words or. Right? So here's our method max3. It returns the maximum value of a, b, and c. Right? So if a is greater than or equal to b, right, and a is greater than or equal to c, right, then the result is obviously a. Right? A is the largest value. Right? Else if b is greater than a and b is greater than or equal to c, then the result is b. Right? Otherwise, there's only one choice. The result is c. Right? And then I can return the result at the end. Right? There's many, many, many different ways to write this method. Right? This is just one of them. Okay, so if I want to write the same method in Java, right, again, right, public, static, max3, right, this one's going to take in 3 doubles, a, b, and c. Right? So if it's going to take 3 doubles, the maximum value is going to be a double. Right? So the return type is double. All right, so there's quite a few differences, right, between the two between this method and the corresponding Python function. Right? If I want to write it the exact same way, right, notice that in Python you can just say result equals something, right, and then suddenly the variable result appears, right, and you can use it from this point on. Right? In Java that doesn't work. Right? So if I want to use the variable result, I have to declare the variable result. Right? So we say double result and then nothing. You can initialize it here if you want to. In this particular case, we don't have to because we're going to assign it a value here, here, or here. Right? So you don't have to initialize here if you don't want to. All right. Now what about our conditions? So when you write your conditions in Java, the condition, there's only one condition. You can combine conditions inside, but there's only one. Right? Or there's only one overall condition. Right? Must be inside parentheses. Right? So the operator greater than or equal to is the same. Right? Less than or equal to, equals, equals, exclamation mark equals for not equals. Right? And there is no and word in Java. Right? So if you want logical and, right, it's 2 ampersands. Right? Ampersand, ampersand. Right? Not the single ampersand. Right? The single ampersand actually means something else. It does work, but if you're combining logical conditions, you should use the double ampersand. Right? Now I can say result is a. That's fine because my variable result here is declared. Right? And then the rest of the method looks pretty much the same. Right? So, oh, do I? Hang on. No, I just want to fly through. Okay, so I do go over all of that later. Okay, just like in Python, that else part of the if-else statement doesn't have to be there. Well, of the if-else statement doesn't have to be there. Right? So I can get rid of the else clause in the original Python function, right, simply by assuming the largest value is c, right, or the largest value is a, or the largest value is b. It doesn't matter. Right? So I'm going to assume the largest value is c, right, and now I only need the if and the else if. Right? I can get rid of the else part, right, and then just return result at the end. Right? The same is true in Java. Right? The else part of the else, if, else statement is not required. Right? The only part of the if statement that's required is the first if. Okay, so that's similar to how things work in Python. Any conditions must appear inside parentheses. Right? That you have to put the parentheses in Java. If you don't, the compiler will complain. Right? Okay, now what about scope? So Python's got Java. The way scope works is different than the way it works in Python. So the scope of a variable, that's the part of your code where the variable name is usable. Right? So in Java, the scope starts where you declare the variable, and then it ends at the end of the block where the variable was declared in. Right? So for your parameters, the scope starts here. Right? So a, b, and c. So this says that your method max3 has these variables a, b, and c. The scope starts immediately inside the body of the method. Right? So now at this point, a, b, and c are usable. Right? Where is the end of this scope? Well, it's down here. Right? So I can use a, b, and c anywhere between there and there. Right? Okay, now what about result? Right? So I've declared result right here. Right? So immediately after that semicolon, the name result is usable. Right? And it's usable up to the end of the block. So that's here. Right? So result is usable all the way pretty much everywhere inside that method body. Right? Immediately after you declare the variable. All right, so it's easy to make. So remember back here in our Python program. Where's the original one? Here, right? I can say result A, result B, and result C here, right? I don't have to declare it up here. Right? That's not true in Java. Where'd it go? Here, right? So suppose I try to do the same thing in Java. Right? So if A is greater than B, and if A is greater than C, double result equals A. Right? So what does that do? Well, that makes a variable called result. Right? That name result is usable here, right, immediately after the semicolon. Where is it usable to? To the end of the block in which it was declared in. Well, there's a block right here. Right? So the name result is only usable inside that block. Right? It does not exist outside of this block. Right? So this is fine. Right? But as soon as this code is done running, the name result doesn't exist anymore. So suppose that condition is not true. So we jump to the else if part. Right? So if B is greater than A and B is greater than C, let's assume that's true. Right? Then we say double result equals B. This is also fine. Right? This result is different from that result. Right? Because we're inside of different blocks. Right? I've got a block here. Now I've got a separate block here. Right? So this is fine. It gets set to B. Where does that variable exist? Well, from this point to here. Right? And then it doesn't exist anymore. So when you get to this line here, there is no result. Right? There's no variable called result inside of this method as far as Java is concerned. Right? So now you get an error. Right? No declared variable named result. Right? So you have to be careful where you declare your variables if you want to use them somewhere later on inside of your method, right? Or inside of a block. Right? It doesn't quite work the same way that it does in Python. Okay, any questions about that? If you've only done Python, that's a little bit new. Right? If you're used to Java, then this isn't new at all. Or it shouldn't be anyway. Okay, you are allowed to have more than one return statement in a method, same as in Python. Right? So I don't actually need that variable called result. Right? If A is greater than B and A is greater than C, I can just return A. That's fine. Right? But if you have a return statement, you can't have any code immediately after the return statement. Right? I think the same is true in Python, although I'm not 100% sure. Right? So the return statement ends the method. So logically, it makes no sense if there's code on that red line there. Right? And the compiler doesn't let you put code on that red line there. Right? If you try to put any code that might run here, the compiler will flag that as an error and your program won't compile. Right? Similarly here, if B is the greatest value, I can just return B. Right? If I get to the end of the method, I know that the largest value must be C, so I can return C. Right? But again, I can't put any code here, and I can't put any code here. Right? But you are allowed to have multiple return statements. Right? Some people consider this to be bad style, to be bad form, to have more than one return statement inside of a method or function. Right? Okay, so a method that returns a value must always return a value. Now, so what does that mean? Well, we know that already, right? So, but you might write some code that appears to be logically correct, right? So in other words, it's mathematically correct. Right? So in this case here, right, I know that the answer, whatever the answer is, it's either A, B, or C, right? I know that must be the case. So I could try to write an if-else-if statement here. Sorry, if-else-if, else-if statement here, right? So if A is the largest value, return A, right? Else if B is the largest value, return B, right? Else if C is the largest value, return C, right? This is actually a fairly common error made by people who are new to programming, right? So there's a couple of errors here. Number one, that else if is not required, right? You can replace that with an else, right? Two, you can actually get rid of the else if you wanted to, right? But you should not use an else if here, right? This really should be an else statement. That condition should not be here. However, you could write it like this, or you could try to write it like this, right? And then you say, well, if A is the biggest value, I'm going to return A. If B is the largest value, I'm going to return B. If C is the largest value, I'll return C, right? And this looks, so if you think about this for a few minutes, right, mathematically this is correct. Your Java compiler is not a mathematician, right? It does not try to do any logical deduction on your code. It's probably not true. It probably does do some. It just doesn't do this particular one, right? So what does your compiler see? It sees, well, there's an if statement here. This condition may or may not be true, right? So in other words, this statement, the return A, may or may not run, right? Then I have an else if, right? This condition may or may not be true. So this statement might not run, or it might run. Then I have another else if statement, right? This condition may or may not be true. That line may or may not run. right? So as far as the compiler is concerned, it is possible to get to the red lines here, right? Even though mathematically it is impossible to get to the red line there, right? So because it's possible to get to here, the compiler is looking for a return statement because you said this returns a double, right? There's no return statement here. The compiler thinks there's a mistake, right? Even though you can prove mathematically there's not, right? But again, compiler's not a mathematician, right? So number one, don't write that last else if, just turn it into an else and everything's fine, right? If you turn that into an else, then the compiler knows it has to end up here, right? If these two conditions are not true, right? So if you turn that into an else, everything's fine. If this is a condition, then it's not fine because it's possible, as the compiler thinks it's possible to get to here. Right, so watch out for that error. Okay, there's no and word in Java, right? If you want to use and, it's double ampersand. Right? If you want to use or, it's double vertical bar. Right? And in Java and in Python, actually, and has higher precedence than or. Right? So what does that mean? It means if you have a statement that has multiple ands and ors in it, the ands happen first, from left to right, right? Unless you have parentheses, right? If you have parentheses, then the stuff in parentheses always happens first. So we have a statement here. We've got something or and, right? And so the way this gets evaluated is that it gets evaluated, and that gets evaluated, and then the and gets evaluated, right? Because the and has higher precedence than the or. Right? So this part here gets evaluated first, right? The part with the and, right? And then the or part gets evaluated, right? So is that true or false? Or is all of this true or false, right? Is how that gets evaluated, right? Okay, so this is the method for computing is a year a leap year, right? And so most people think, well, a lot of people think a leap year is any year that's divisible by 4. That's not quite true. So a leap year is any year that's divisible by 400. Right? So how do I check if an integer is evenly divisible by 400? Well, I use that percent sign operator. Right? That's the remainder operator. Right? So remainder is you take the value here, divide it by 400, and you look at the remainder. Right? So if the year is 2001, right, divided by 400, that's 5 and a bit. Right? So there's a bit. Right? So it's 5. So the remainder is 1. Right? So is the remainder 1, is 1 equal to 0? The answer is no. Right? So 2001 is not divisible by 400. Right? So a year is a leap year if it's divisible by 400, or if it's divisible by 4. Right? So is the year divisible by 4, but not divisible by 100? Right? So, So year, divide it by 100, and look at the remainder. Right? If the remainder is not 0, right, then the condition is true. Right? So, for example, the year 2100 is not a leap year. Right? It's divisible by 4, but it's also divisible by 100, and it's not divisible by 400. Right? And so this is an example here that shows that and has higher precedence than or. Right? Now, you might say this is a little hard to remember. Right? It's also a little hard to read. That's fine. You can always stick in parentheses. Right? So if you don't like reading that previous statement, and you really want to highlight the fact that this whole condition is actually one condition that should be evaluated first, right? Then just put it in parentheses. Okay. Here's an if statement, right? So if this big condition is true, I'm going to return true, right? Otherwise, I'm going to return false. Right? What you've written here, so the way this is written is technically correct. Right? You could also write something similar. Right? I could take all of this, right, and then write equals equals true. Right? So if some condition equals equals true, return true. Right? Or if some condition equals equals false, return false. Right? That's actually quite common to see in a lot of code written by new programmers. Right? You should try to avoid doing that. Right? Here, there's no reason to actually use an if statement. Right? Here, I'm basically returning the result of this entire conditional statement. Right? I want to know, is that conditional statement true or false? Right? I don't actually need an if statement for that. You can just return the conditional statement. Right? So here, right? It's the same condition, right? The result of the condition is true or false, right? So I can just return that value. I don't actually need the if statement, right? So you should start to train yourself to recognize these situations, right? And if you are writing code like if x equals true, return true, or if x equals y, return false, equals false, return false, right? You should try to avoid doing that, right? Just return the Boolean value directly, right? So here we're just returning the overall Boolean value directly, right? Without the if statement. The exclamation mark is not in Java, right? In Python, it's just the word not, right? In Java, it's exclamation mark, right? So we've got is leap year here, right? I'm going to assume that that method is defined in a class called lecture3, right? So I'm going to write another method somewhere, right? Days in February, right? It takes in a year, right? And so you know that if February has a leap year, then it has 29 days, right? Otherwise, it has 28 days, right? So here, I can call is leap year, right? And pass in the year, right? That returns true or false, right? So the exclamation mark negates the result of is leap year, right? So if the year is not a leap year, right? February has 28 days. Right? Otherwise, return 29. Of course, you could write this the other way, right? If is leap year, return 29. Otherwise, return false. Right? But this example is here just to show you that the exclamation mark is the negation operator, right? The not operator. This is another big difference between Python and Java. So in Python, you can chain comparisons, right? So here's a method that takes in your grade as a number and converts it to a letter grade, right? I don't do all of the Queen's letter grades, right? A plus, A minus, and all that sort of stuff, right? Because it doesn't fit on the slide. So if your grade is greater than 80, the result's an A, right? Else if your grade is between 70 and less than 80, right? Return a B. The result is B, and so on and so on and so on, right? So here I can write 70 less than or equal to grade less than 80. Right? You can't write that in Java. Right? You can chain the operator here in Python. In Java, you have to use an AND. Right? So if your grade is greater than 70, greater than or equal to 70, and your grade is less than 80. Right? If you try to write that like that, right, the Java compiler will complain. Right? It'll say, I forget what the exact error is, but you can't chain the operators in Java. Right? If you have more than one condition that you want to check, then you have to combine it with and or. Right? Okay, so remember that there are no chain comparisons. Oh. All right, we're on deck 4 now, which is not here. So. Okay, any questions so far? Everything should be, so the changes between the two languages are, there are differences. So you have to get used to the differences. Every once in a while, there are a few students who in 124, who at the end of 124 are still writing Python instead of Java. Right? You have to get used to transitioning your Python, the way you would write something in Python over to the way you would write something in Java. Okay, what do we do? Today, this lecture is the array lecture. All right, so in Python, you've got lists, right? So Python lists are really handy, right? And they're really powerful to use, right? So you know that anything inside of square brackets, right? That indicates a list or a sequence in, a list in Java. In Python, right? And in Python, a list is just what's called a sequence, right? So here I've got a list called T, right? It contains the, in this case, the strings A, B, C, and D. Right? You know that you can use square bracket and an index, right, to get an element out of the list. Right? So T square bracket 0, that's the string A. Right? So I can assign a reference to that string to the variable first. Right? If I want the length of the list, then I use the length function, right, len. Right? So there's len. Right? That's 4 in this case, right, obviously. If I want the last element of the list, one way to get to it is to use the length of the list minus 1. Right? So that's the last index in the list. right? In Python, you can also use -1, right? I can assign to elements of the list, right? So t square bracket 1, well, that's the element, that's the second element of the list, right? So I can change that to be a b, right? And that would change the second element of the list t to a capital B, right? That changes the third element of the list to the capital C, right? Okay, so in Java, there is a list. There's also something called an array, right? So the thing that most closely corresponds to a Python list is a Java list. It uses a completely different syntax than the Python list, all right? The thing that uses this similar syntax to a Python list is what's called a Java array, right? But there's a big differences between arrays and lists, right? Which is weird because the syntax looks the same, right? So in Java, an array, it is a container type object, right? So it can hold more than one element, right? However, it always holds a fixed number of elements. Furthermore, they must be of a single type, right? You know that in Python, you can take a list and you can put whatever you want in the list, right? I can put the number 1 in, then I can put the string hello, and then I can put the number 2.0, and so on and so on and so forth. That doesn't work in Java, right? So I can make an array or a list, right? Once I make the array, though, I can only put elements of the specified type into the array, right? So if I make an array of int, I can only put ints into the array. Furthermore, the size of the array is fixed, right? It's constant, right? The length of the array is established when you make the array, right? So when you create the array, you have to say how big is the array. All right? So to declare an array variable, it's the type of the element, right? So double, I want an array that can hold some doubles, and then a pair of empty square brackets, right? And then the name of the variable, right? So this says that collection, is an empty array of double values, right? So in other words, it's an array of length 0, which isn't really useful. This doesn't actually make the array yet, right? This just says that collection can store an array variable, right? Does it actually make an empty array? I think in this case, it does actually make an empty array. Okay, so hang on. All right, so let's carry on. All right, now, your arrays in Java, they are way less flexible than Python lists, right? So they don't do anything, like they almost do nothing, right? Basically, you can make the array and you can get an element out of it, you can set an element in it, right? And you can ask for its length. And that's pretty much all you can do with it, right? But the syntax looks similar, right? What are the differences? There's no slicing, right? So in Python, you can ask for part of a list, right? I can ask for elements 1, 2, and 3 with a slice, right? Can't do that in Java. No negative indexing in Java, right? So if you try to use -1 to get to the last element of the array, that doesn't work, right? So no negative indexes. Furthermore, you have to specify the element type of the array, right? So here, I've got an array T, right? It's an array of car, right? I can use, when you declare the array, you are allowed to initialize the array at the point where you declare it, right? So I can say car square bracket T equals brace, brace. And then I can put the list or the sequence of values inside the braces, right? So this makes an array T whose values are A, B, C, and D, right? So that makes an array of length 4, right? If I want to get the first element out of the array, and I want to store it in a variable, well, I have to make the variable, right? So what are the elements in T? Well, they're car, right? So I make a variable called first, its type is car, and I can assign the first element of the array to the variable first, right? So first is now the letter A, right? If I want the last character, right? In Java, there's no negative indexing, right? So I need to know what is the length of the array, right? Because I need to get to this number here, which is 3, right? That index is index 3, right? So I need to know the length. To get the length of a Java array, it's the name of the array, dot length, right? It's not the function len, right? There is no function len in Java, right? All arrays know how long they are. You just ask the array how long is it, right? That's t dot length, right? So t dot length -1, that's the last valid index of the array t, right? And so assuming it's not negative, right? And so that's going to give you 3 in this case, right? So that's just t3, which is the d, right? Store that in last. Right? If you want to do assignment, it works the exact same as assigning to an element of a list in Python. Okay, So an array can initialize its size and elements by writing the elements in a comma-separated list, right? Just like that, right? But that's called initialization, right? So that's different than assignment, right? So I think most programmers, when they see a language or when they learn a language, they look at the equal sign and they say, oh, that's the assignment operator, right? That's not exactly true, right? So when you create a variable, right? So I'm creating a variable called t at this point, and you use the assignment, you use the equal sign. This is called initialization, right? Initialization is different than assignment, right? So here, this is initialization. I'm allowed to use braces here, right? Here, I've got a declaration of a variable u, right? On the next line, I try to write u equals brace something, right? So in other words, I try to make an array, x, y, z, and assign that to u. That doesn't work. This is assignment here, right? I'm using a variable that's already been created and trying to assign it a value, right? So assignment is distinct from initialization, right? Although most new programmers aren't aware of that fact, right? So there is no way to use a brace and then a bunch of stuff for assignment, right? That doesn't work. Okay, if you want to make an array, it's often the case you don't know what should go into the array, right? You might know how big should the array be, right? But I don't know right away what am I going to put into the array, right? So if you don't know what you're going to put into the array, initialization is not useful, right? So now what do you do? Okay, so now what you do is to make an array, you use what's called the new operator, right? So here I'm going to make an array variable called collection, right? At this point, collection doesn't actually refer to an array, right? It's just a variable, right? I can put an array, or I can store a reference to an array in collection, right? But I don't have an array yet, right? So in order to use collection as though it were an array, I have to make an array and assign it to collection, right? So the way you make an array is as follows, right? If I want to make an array of length 10, right, of double values, because the type of my array is double, right? Then I write new element type, so double, square bracket, and then the number of the size of the array, the length of the array. Right? So new double 10, that makes an array of length 10. I can store a reference to that array in the variable collection. Right? So array variables are reference variables in Java. Okay, if you make an array of primitive type, all of the elements get initialized to some default value when you use new. Right? So here's some bools. Right? Some bools is just going to be an array of 3 Boolean values. Right? So it turns out if you have a Boolean value, an array of Booleans, all the values get initialized to false. Right? So the default value for array of Boolean, the default element value is false. Here's some ints. Right? So new int 4. Right? That makes an array of length 4, right, of ints. All the ints get set to 0. Right? So that's 3 falses. That's 4 zeros. This is 5 0.0s. Right? If you want to print out the arrays, unfortunately, you can't use print line and then just say some bools. Right? Or I can't use print and say some bools, or I can't use print and say some doubles. Right? If you do that, you get some strange string. Right? You just get some funny sequence of letters and numbers. Right? Instead, what you have to do is you have to take the array, convert it to a string, and then print the string. Right? So the way you do that is you use this method called arrays.toString, right? And then pass in the array. Right? So it takes the array, computes a string equal to the elements of the array, and then it returns that string. Now I can print the string. Right? So it's a little bit, it's slightly awkward to print an array of stuff in Java. Right? Whereas with a list in Python, you just print the list, right? If you have a list in Java, you can also just print the list. If you have an array, you have to go one extra step and call the method. Right? If you take 220 and you take the C course, it's much worse to print an array. Right? Okay, so if you make an array of primitive type, then the default values are either false, if you have a Boolean, everything else is 0. Right? So all the numeric types, their default value gets set to 0 for an array. Okay, so I have an array and I want to set them to some value not equal to 0 or false. Right? There's a method called fill, or arrays.fill, that will do it for you. So here I make some doubles, right? I've got an array of length 10. Right? If I print out that array, I get 10 zeros, or 10 0.0s. Right? If I want to replace all those values with 1, I just call fill. Right? So arrays.fill, pass in the array, and then pass in the value that you want to set all the elements to. Right? So this will put 10 ones into that array sum doubles. Right? When you print that, you'll get 10 1.0s. If you want to do anything else, right? So if I want to put in a sequence of values, say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, now you have to use a loop, right? And you have to write the code yourself. Okay, the number of elements in the array. So every array knows how long it is, right? That's in the what's called a field named length, right? So here, if I have a variable called collection, right? There's no array yet, right? I just have a variable. I don't have the array, right? Here, I now have an array of length 10, right? So collection now refers to an array of length 10, right? Here, collection refers to no array, right? Here, it refers to an array of length 10. How long is the array? Well, that's just collection.length. That's an int value. Right. Okay, so you know that so similar to a Python list, the elements in an array are called elements. Right, so here's an array of length 10, shown in green. Right, each box can hold an element. Right, in an array, there's always something in the box. Right, so there's always some value in the box. There's never no value in a box. You use an index to get to the value or to access the value, either to set the value or to access the value that's inside one of these boxes. Right? The last valid index for an array is always its length minus 1. Right? There is no negative indexing, unfortunately. Negative indexing is super useful. Right? So if you come from Python and then have to switch to Java or C, it becomes awkward. Right. So you have to remember, okay, so my indexes are always starting at 0. They always go up to the length of the array minus 1. Right? So you can access the elements using your index. Right? So imagine, so back here, I've made collection is an array of length 10. Right? So now I can set the first element of the array to 100. Right? I can ask for the first element of the array if I want to. I can set all of the other elements up to index 9 to whatever value I want. As soon as you use an index that's less than 0, or in this case greater than 9, right, you get an exception. Right? So collection 10 equals 100, that throws an exception in Java. Right? So you get what's called an array index out of bounds exception, and your program stops running. Right? So in other words, it's an error to try to access an array element that doesn't exist. Right? And the error in Java, you get what's called an exception. Okay. Okay, let's quickly do the one loop, and then we'll call it quits for the week. All right, so when you're working with a list in Python, right, it's often the case you want to loop over all the elements in the list and do something with the element. Right? So here's max. Right? This is the max. This is an implementation of max in Java. Right, I want to find the maximum element in this list, in this list T. Right, so how do you write this? Well, this isn't quite correct. Right? So how does this work? I'm going to set high. That's going to be the value of the maximum element. I'm going to set that to T0. Right, so that's going to be set to the first element of the list. I'm going to loop over all the elements in the list. Right, so for each elem in T. Right, so that makes a loop variable called elem. Right, which corresponds to an element in T. Right, it changes each iteration through the loop. Right, if that value is greater than high, I'm going to set high to elem. Right, that processes all the elements in the list, and then that gives you the highest element in the list. Right, there's a mistake in this method. What's the mistake? Anybody? 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 How about you? Because I can hear you talking all the time. What's the mistake? There is a mistake. It's on the first line. If that helps. Does it not help? What happens if your list is empty? What does T0 do? It raises an error in Python, right? You can't access element 0 if the list is empty. The correct implementation of this method checks if the list is empty, right? And then does something. It either raises an error or returns some sort of funny value or does something, right? But that's technically an error. Right? So you have to be careful when you're working with lists or arrays, right? You're always asking, Is the thing empty or not? Right? Because that often ends up being a special case. What about the corresponding Java method? Well, it's now an array, right? So now I have a double square bracket array, right? So the maximum value in this list, if that's an array of double, then the maximum value must also be a double, right? Okay, so everything else is pretty much the same except for the loop, right? So I'm going to set high to be the first element of the array, right? Now the for each loop in in Java looks like this, right? So it's for round brackets, right? Parentheses. They have to be there, right? The way you read this is, right? So elem is your loop variable, right? All variables in Java need a type. So the type, what's the type of elem? Well, the type of elem is double, right? So for each element, that's a double in my array, right? So that's what the colon means, right? So for each element in array, right? Now it's a loop. When you have a loop, you have a body of the loop, so that has to be inside braces, right? So there's braces there, right? And now if elem is greater than high, high becomes equal to elem, right? Return high, right? And away you go, right? So there is a for each loop in Java. Looks slightly different than the for each loop in Python, all right? All right, so I'm over time. We'll call it quits there and pick this up next week.